Right by Them, a Magnus Archives fanfiction written by Esperosis and read by Ibis Podfic. Chapter 13, Confession. It was the fourth day of the week-long vacation that life had so generously given them when John found himself pacing around his flat. He was tense as thoughts swam around in his newly non-concussed head. Something was wrong. Something was missing. But for the life of him, he couldn't figure out what it was. Everything had gone perfectly, hadn't it? There was that bit at the end there when he fell unconscious after Tim had dropped him, something he had apologized for profusely, to instinctively cover his ears when Brenda started screaming, so theoretically... No. There was no possible way anyone got replaced, right? But then, what was this feeling? This nagging feeling in the back of his mind that something wasn't quite right, that something was missing, something that he was just too stupid to realize. He kept replaying it over and over in his head, but he couldn't for the life of him figure out what it was. He was driving himself up the wall, and he couldn't even ask anyone because none of his friends would have any idea what he was talking about. It was infuriating, and it made him want to rip his own hair out. He rechecked the photos. On his phone was a picture of the four of them when they had all gone out for drinks one night. Tim was holding the phone out, grinning from ear to ear as Sasha leaned into his right side, and John was dragged into Tim's left side by Tim's arm. Martin leaned in towards John, smiling a bit sheepishly, even as his ears tinged pink. John always had to drag his eyes away from Martin when he looked at the picture. It was digital, taken on Tim's phone, and sent to everyone through the group chat. It was the perfect bait for the not them, easily altered by their reality warping abilities. Then, he held up the Polaroid, nearly identical to the one taken at his surprise birthday party last time around. The only difference this time was that instead of John looking mildly disgruntled, he was genuinely smiling. He studied each of their faces for likely the sixth time, then compared them to the digital photo, finding everything lined up perfectly. Everyone was the same as they should have been. Nobody had been replaced. So what was this feeling? This nagging feeling in the back of his mind that something was wrong and that he was missing something so glaringly obvious he'd kick himself when he realized it. A feeling right on the tip of his tongue. So close he could taste it if not understand it. It took him right back to his days of whispering conspiratorially into a tape recorder like a lunatic about supplementals and how Martin was obviously planning to kill him because he was worried about his traumatized asshole of a boss. Speaking of which, he distinctly remembers Martin talking about how it would have been nice, the two of them having a normal office romance together, just living and loving each other normally without the whole apocalypse thing. The optimal time to have started such a thing would have been months ago. The second best time, John supposed, would be right now. But was it too early? Was Martin ready for that? John certainly was. He wanted to kiss Martin from the very first moment he laid eyes upon the beautiful man. But he couldn't rush things. He couldn't ruin this. If he somehow scared Martin away, John didn't even want to think about it. But even so, he couldn't wait forever. Things were only going to get worse from here, and he wanted to at least start the relationship at a calmer time this go around, preferably when Martin was deeply traumatized. Right now, he was only a little traumatized, so that was better, right? Comparatively speaking, at least. John scrubbed his hand over his face as he finally stopped his frantic pacing. He was, admittedly, not the best when it came to romance, but he really, really wanted to try for Martin. He just had no idea what he was doing. John's phone began to vibrate on the table at John's side, reaching out and grabbing it without even looking at the caller ID. "Hello," he sighed into the phone. "Ew, boss man," Tim's cheery voice washed over him. "How's your head feeling?" "Hey, John," Sasha's voice carried over from somewhere else in Tim's apartment. "I'm doing all right," John replied. "The headache finally disappeared about an hour ago." The four of them had essentially been living in Tim's apartment for the first 3 days of his existence, but when almost all of his symptoms had faded by this morning, John had insisted upon returning to his own flat. Everyone had been hesitant, but John had dug his heels in, and they let him, and Martin had also returned to his own flat. Since then, both Tim and Martin had been calling him every half hour or so to make sure he hadn't died or had an aneurysm or something. "That's fast," Sasha whistled, her voice growing louder as she presumably approached him. "Concussions usually take a week at least to heal." "Yes, it's fortunate," he frowned. "Is everything okay?" Tim asked. "Yes, it's... because if your head hurts, you've gotta tell us, John," Tim cut in, more insistent. He still felt guilty about the whole thing. "It's not," John sighed. "It's not my head." "What's wrong, John?" Sasha asked, concerned. John cringed. He could probably deflect, saying he was bothered about the worms, but no. He wanted to be more open with them. He wanted to trust them, be closer to them, confide in them. This was important. John sighed again, trying to find the words as his friends patiently waited for him to get himself in order on the other end of the line. "I want to, if I asked Martin out, do you think Martin would be..." "God damn it." "Hold up," Tim saved him from himself. "Correct me if I'm wrong, but..." Tim's voice grew more excited, barely constrained glee evident in his voice. "Are you trying to say you're interested in Martin, like, romantically?" "Yes." Tim and Sasha immediately began celebrating and whooping on the other end of the phone as John went red, his face hot as he shifted uncomfortably. "So you can ask him outright?" Tim asked. John could practically hear him vibrating. I mean, John sputtered. I don't even know if he likes me." "John!" Both Tim and Sasha groaned at the same time. You cannot be serious," Sasha whined. At the same time, Tim laughed. "John, that man's got it bad for you. I swear the entire institute knows about its crush." Relief flooded through John's chest. "You think so?" "Yes!" They both shouted into the phone, and John had to pull the device back from his ear, cringing at the noise. "For the love of God, John, ask the poor man out," Sasha begged. "The pining is killing me." "I personally find it very entertaining," Tim grinned before laughing in mild pain as Sasha presumably started whacking him. "So," John spoke up, "if I asked him out, he'd say yes." "Definitely," Sasha confirmed as Tim agreed. John frowned. "And you don't think it would, I don't know, be weird?" When they started a relationship last time, it was well after any illusions of the archives being a normal workplace were thoroughly destroyed. Titles like boss, employee, and assistant were useless pleasantries. They were all prisoners of the archives and Elias. But this wasn't the case this time around. Right now, the only people who knew the truth were Elias and John. As much as the others were aware, this was a perfectly normal desk job. Well, not perfectly normal, but mostly normal, if you ignored all the evil murder worms and men with too many bones. He had, admittedly, not even glanced over the HR policy Elias had sent him. He couldn't care less about it. It wasn't like Elias was going to fire or transfer any of them, so it didn't matter at all to John. But what if it mattered to Martin? He was still trying to make money to take care of his mother, and he, quite literally, couldn't afford to get fired. He had no idea he couldn't/wouldn't be fired. But that was just the point. He still didn't know. What if he didn't want to date John because of the complications of dating his boss? What if it was a weird power dynamic? What if he rejected him out of fear of getting fired? It made John just sick to think about. "Would what be weird?" Sasha asked. "I mean," John cringed, "I'm his boss." "Are you worried we're going to get jealous?" Tim teased. "Because if you want smoochies for good performance reviews—" "Ah!" Tim cried out as an audible smack was heard on the other end of the line. "Tim!" Sasha playfully scolded him as Tim began to laugh. "No, it's not." John pinched the bridge of his nose. "You don't think it would be a strange sort of power dynamic or something? It would, wouldn't it? Maybe I shouldn't." "John," Sasha cut him off, "I understand why you're worried, but please believe me when I say it's not a problem. Yes, you're our boss. Martin's too. But first and foremost, you're our friend. We're a team in the archives, remember? I promise you, Martin won't care if you're his boss. Plus," Tim added, "Sasha and I aren't going to report you to HR, and nobody else comes down into the archives anyway, so you don't have to worry about that." John's heart sank. "It's against HR policy?" "Recently updated," Tim confirms grimly. "Damn," John sighed. "I didn't even read it after Elias sent it to me." "Elias sent you the HR policy on workplace relationships?" Tim asked. "Yeah." "When?" Sasha piped up. "A little over a month ago." "You mean that day we got the freaky table and Elias was all weird to you?" Tim asked. "How did—" "Martin told us after it happened," Sasha answered him. "Hold on. Elias mentioned him sending you counseling info as well, and I've been meaning to ask about that. When did he send that?" John cringed. "The same time?" "So," Tim spoke, "let me get this straight. We get a spooky table. Elias is super weird towards you about the spooky table and makes you have a panic attack. Then, afterward, he sends you an email with counseling information and the HR policy on workplace relationships." "Yes, that about, sums it up." There was silence on the other end of the line for a few long moments. John shifted uncomfortably once again. "I feel like," Tim frowned, "like, that has to be reportable to HR, right? It feels like it should be like harassment or something." Sasha hummed grimly. "It's definitely weird, but I don't think HR could do anything about it." "John, from now on, one of his assistants is going to chaperone all your meetings with Elias, okay?" Tim stated. "Is that really necessary?" "Yes," Tim and Sasha spoke in unison, and John's mouth snapped shut. "Anyway," Sasha replied, "we just won't tell Elias about this." "Do you think Martin will go for that?" John asked. "Definitely," Sasha confirmed. "As I stated before," Tim said, "the boy has it bad, like tragically bad. I feel like if you propose to him, he'd likely take a few minutes to consider it before asking to maybe go on a date first." Wow, John laughed readily. "Well, I'm certainly not going to do that." "I'm just saying he'll 100% say yes," Tim hummed. "That's good to know," John sighed in relief. Sasha then piped up. "You should ask him at drinks tonight." "Drinks?" "Right," Tim explained. "Since you're feeling better, we were calling to let you know we set up some We're Not Dead or Flesh Hives celebratory drinks down at the Good Pub by the Institute. Martin's already coming, so you should too. You're the man of the hour, after all." "I don't think," John averted his eyes, staring at some nebulous bit on the floor. "I didn't really do anything." You figured out the safest place for us to go, and without your lighter, we might still be down there, or worse, Sasha pointed out. That's not... John, you saved our asses back there, Tim cut off, his voice serious. Thank you, genuinely. Yeah, John, Sasha agreed. John felt his breath leave him as he glanced back down at the Polaroid, everyone's smiling faces looking back at him. At this point, the last time, the picture was almost completely wrong. John and Tim were covered in worm scars, Sasha had been replaced, and Martin wasn't smiling anymore. Now, this time, it was still perfectly accurate. No scars, no strangers, no deaths. They were okay. John had saved them. Thank you, John finally replied, his voice barely above a whisper. See you soon? Tim asked. Yeah, John nodded. Take care of yourself, okay? Sasha told him. Yeah. John pulled the phone away from his ear and hung up. He took a few moments to collect himself, sitting down and leaning backward on his couch, and took a shuddering breath. Things were going well. They were. Everything was going okay because everyone was safe and alive. The worst that had happened was a bit of a concussion and the loss of his main pair of glasses. Thank God for backups. They were okay. Even as that sense of something being wrong pushed at the back of his mind, he tried to push it down. Things were okay. They were going to keep being okay if John had anything to say about it. And he did. John took another deep breath and relaxed, letting his eyes close and his muscles relax. There was a knock at his door, making him flinch and open his eyes. He lifted his head up and peered over at the door, and for the briefest of moments debated not answering. John? Martin's voice called out, and John could feel his heart rate pick up. Are you doing all right? Yes, I'm quite all right, John called out as he scrambled off the couch and towards the door, quickly opening it to reveal Martin. Oh, Martin exclaimed as he saw John, his face turning slightly pink as John realized he was in a loose fade t-shirt and long pajama bottoms. Not exactly scandalous, but he doesn't think Martin's seen him in anything other than his professional attire at this point. John flushed slightly as he glanced down his nose and back up at Martin. I was just, coming to walk with you to the pub, Martin offered. Right. Why don't you, come inside, John offered, stepping aside. I have to get changed. I can just wait outside, Martin offered. Nonsense, it's cold outside, John insisted as he stepped just a bit more to the side. Oh, all right. Martin very carefully stepped inside John's flat, his eyes glancing around. The flat's very clean. John sighed but couldn't stop the smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Yes, clean was one way to put the barren insides. John never saw any point in buying anything more than that what wasn't absolutely necessary. It wasn't as if he spent much time here. The only personal items there were a bookcase full of worn paperbacks and a few pictures of John, Sasha, Tim, Martin, and Georgie stuck to his fridge. I know I don't exactly have the most homely flat, but it's enough for eating and sleeping, which is all I ever really do here anyway, he briefly explained. Martin went pink. I didn't mean... No, it's quite all right. John began to blush pink himself. I'm not upset. Ha, Martin laughed nervously. Do you, want any tea? John gave a shaky, nervous smile. That would be lovely, Martin. I'll, change while you put the kettle on? That's, yeah, Martin nodded as he began to rummage around John's kitchen. John quickly retreated into his bedroom and threw on the first pair of trousers and button-up that he could find. He checked himself out in the mirror and furiously fixed his hair. John had no idea how he was going to manage to walk side by side with Martin all the way to the pub like this, and someone muster up the courage to ask Martin out in front of both Tim and Sasha. It sounded and felt impossible. He had no idea how he was supposed to do it. He looked at himself in the mirror and took a deep breath. Come on, John. You'll face down Elder's horrors and the end of the world. Asking Martin out for coffee can't be more difficult than all of that. It felt more difficult. It felt so much more difficult when the looming possibility of no was still very real in his mind. He took a deep breath and made up his mind, walking out of his bedroom right as the kettle began to screech. Water's just boiled, Martin hummed. It'll take a few more minutes to steep. That's all right, John replied. Martin, I wanted to ask you something. Martin turned to look at him, his hair and eyes catching the overhead lights in the kitchen, illuminating him in a way that made John's heart leap into his throat as he dipped the tea bag into the mugs. John's mugs. Yeah? He asked, looking nervous as the lights highlighted the beautiful red of his cheeks. I was just wondering if, maybe you would like, John trailed off before clenching his fist and forcing himself to just spit it out for Christ's sake. Do you want to get coffee sometime? Oh, Martin went bright red, his eyes darting away from John as quickly as possible. John felt his heartbeat in his throat. That sounds fun. I'm sure Tim and Sasha would find us all going out for coffee fun too, he said. No, John replied, his face burning. No? Martin asked, looking back at him. I didn't mean, John forced himself to breathe, I didn't mean as the four of us. I meant just you and me, together. Martin's face went through a flurry of different emotions very quickly, most of which John couldn't identify, as he remained silent for a long few moments, blinking at John with wide eyes. I mean, Martin asked, his voice quite as invariably hopeful. Like a date? Yes, John confirmed, keeping his eyes locked on Martin, desperate to convey just how serious he was. He tried to pour every ounce of his sincerity into Martin with his gaze as he watched Martin begin to tremble slightly. Oh, he breathed. Yes, he nodded, his voice barely audible. I like that very much. John felt the ball of tension and fear unwrap and dissipate all at once, leaving him gasping as relief flooded every corner of his chest and soaked into his bones. He smiled and laughed as Martin began to smile back. John smiled even wider. I'm glad. Do you, Sunday? Yeah, Martin nodded, his eyes full of wonder, as if he couldn't believe what was happening right in front of his eyes as John beamed at him. Sunday. Great. They both sat there for a long moment, just staring at each other, and John was once again reminded of his original Martin. They both smiled at him, so open and wonderful, but this Martin's smile was so much wider and so much more hopeful, unburdened by the lingering grasp of the lonely. This wasn't his Martin, but John didn't care, because he wasn't his original Martin's John. Not anymore. He had changed in the past year he'd spent here, moved away from the John he had originally been into a new John that these new versions of his loved ones needed. His original Martin was safe and happy with his John, and now these two new versions of themselves can be happy too. This Martin can be happy with this John, the John that he was now. This was his Martin, and he loved him more than anything. Oh God, the tea, Martin exclaimed, before turning back to the tea, which had been steeping for way too long at this point. He quickly removed the tea bags and took a sip, cringing. Yeah, that's definitely ruined, he sighed before lifting the mugs and pouring them into the sink. I don't think it's possible for you to ruin a cup of tea, Martin, John joked. All the more reason for me to pour these down the sink, he smiled. I've got a reputation to uphold. Of course, John smiled. So, Martin turned to him, his eyes quickly giving John a once-over before gluing themselves to his face. Are you ready to go? Think so, John nodded, giving himself a once-over and quickly grabbing his wallet, phone, coat, and keys. John turned off the lights and locked up before they left, the pair walking in an easy silence through the night towards the pub. The night was crisp and cold as the air crept down his collar and brushed his neck, sending a few shivers down his spine as they walked. John found himself occasionally glancing down at their hands as they walked side by side down the sidewalk. They were close, so close that it was easy to gently move his hand to the side and brush their fingers together. The silent question. Would Martin accept? Was it still too early? Before he could second-guess himself anymore, he felt fingers brush his as Martin extended his own hand, the fingers mixing together and latching on. John felt warm as he unlatched his fingers and wound his hand around Martin's, weaving his fingers together as the pair properly held hands. Martin spoke up. John turned to look up at him. John kept his gaze forward, not looking at John. Back in the car, when we were getting the fire extinguishers, he trailed off. John waited for him to find his words. Did you like me? Of course, John replied easily, smiling at him lovingly as Martin turned to look at him. I've cared for you ever since I first met you, Martin. Martin went red at that, his eyes sparkling, and John quickly realized the glittering in his eyes were tears as they began to fall down his face. Oh, Martin? John asked, stopping them as he reached up and wiped a tear from his face. What's wrong? Nothing, Martin replied, wiping the tears from the other side of his face. I'm just happy, I think. I've been interested in you for a while. A mix between a laugh and a sob came out of his mouth. I never thought you'd like me back. To hear that, apparently you felt the same way about me this entire time. Wow. I'm glad they're happy tears, at least, John smiled at him, though his brow was still a bit furrowed, and Martin laughed wetly. Yeah, they're definitely happy tears. I'm really happy for a lot of reasons, I guess. The whole not dying thing, and now my long-term crush has asked me out. It's a lot. We don't have to go to drinks with Tim and Sasha, John replied. If you need some time to yourself. Martin fiercely shook his head as his grip on John's hand tightened. No, I want to go. It's good. I'm all right. Okay, John spoke softly, wiping a few more tears from Martin's face, feeling Martin smile against his palm as he tilted his head into John's hand ever so slightly. You have really small hands, Martin smiled. Wow, John laughed, taking his hand back. Thanks. I like them. Martin squeezed his hand again. I'm glad. John pulled their conjoined hands. Come on, Tim and Sasha are waiting. The silence fell back over the pair, and Martin caught his breath, the pair walking just a bit closer together than before. Soon, sooner than John would have liked, they reached the pub, and Martin let go of John's hand. John had to stop himself from reaching out and grabbing his hand again. The pair stepped into the bar, John's eyes scanning the booth, quickly finding Tim, Sasha, and Georgie! John shouted as he speed-walked over to the booth the three of them sat at, Martin following quickly behind. Oh, hey, John! Georgie grinned as he arrived at the table, two drinks already waiting for John and Martin sitting right next to each other. Yes, hi, Georgie. What are you doing here? John sputtered. Georgie was just telling us about your uni days, Tim laughed. Oh, God. John pinched the bridge of his nose. Sasha burst out laughing. I still can't believe you got arrested for punching a cop. In my defense, you deserved it, John scowled. Oh, we know, Tim cackled. Georgie spared no details. John put his head in his hands and laughed miserably as the trio continued to laugh at his expense. He forced himself to take a deep breath and slide into the booth, Martin sliding in after him. Okay, admittedly, I'm a bit curious about the whole punching a cop thing. Martin turned to him. We'll get to that later. Tim cut John off before he could say anything and pointed at John. More importantly, I think Johnny Boy has something he wants to say. John facepalmed as Sasha elbowed Tim in the ribs, causing him to double over in both laughter and pain. He decided he definitely made the right choice in asking Martin out earlier. John? Martin asked, confused. I already asked him out, Tim, John replied, his voice more of a sigh than actual words. Sasha gasped, and Tim shot back up to stare at them in shock. Georgie grinned ear to ear. Congrats! I assume Martin said yes? Wait, what? Martin sputtered. How did they know you wanted to ask me out? John looked a bit sheepish. I may have asked Tim and Sasha for advice earlier that I wasn't sure you liked me back. You didn't know if I liked you back. Martin laughed now hysterically, as if the mere prospect that he might not like John was the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. I mean, I am your boss, John blushed. There's power dynamics and policies and such. Martin sputtered, I get that, but this isn't really a regular job. And you don't really seem like the type of asshole to abuse power dynamics or whatever. Unlike some people, Sasha muttered bitterly. Right. John nodded. So that's another thing to celebrate tonight, Jory piped up. Celebrating not dying to your horrible job, and John and Martin finally ending their obvious pining. I'll drink to that, Tim grinned as he raised his glass. Cheers! Sasha raised her own glass. Right. John hesitantly raised his glass too, Martin following after him. Their glasses clinked together as the five of them took a long drink from their glasses, Tim slamming his down and sighing loudly, grinning. I'm still wondering how you got here, Georgie. John looked at her. Not that I'm complaining, I'm just confused. Sasha called me, Georgie replied. She actually explained everything that happened after the whole Prentice incident. I was actually surprised you didn't tell me, but then she told me you got concussed, and I figured that was why. Tim winced at that and laughed awkwardly. I didn't. John turned suspiciously to Sasha, who smiled instantly at him. How did you even get Georgie's number? I didn't give it to you. I have my ways, Sasha continued to smile. Tim laughed. Looks like somebody needs to change their phone password again. Sasha! John sputtered indignantly, but she only giggled. I, for one, am glad Sasha hacked her phone. Georgie grinned. Now I have more people to babysit you. I am not a child. John scowled. No, you're just an accident-prone dummy with no concept of self-care, Georgie repeatedly replied, and Tim and Sasha burst out cackling like hyenas at that. Speaking of which, Martin, I need your number. Oh, Martin piped up. Sure. John buried his head in his hands, embarrassed that his now boyfriend exchanged numbers with his ex-girlfriend so they and his friends could talk about how incompetent he is at taking care of himself. He peeked out from behind his fingers, seeing Tim and Sasha laugh so hard they couldn't breathe, and even Georgie and Martin getting along and smiling and laughing. It was nice, very nice. He reflected back. All his friends were okay and safe. Martin had agreed to go out with him, and even Georgie was getting more involved with his friends, meaning she and the Admiral would be around more often. Things were going surprisingly well. He sighed and let himself smile, basking in the warm glow of the pub lights, alcohol, and good company. Things were starting to look up, and John couldn't feel more relieved.